In the middle of the rough hills of Judah, in a village that had been almost ignored, a man took care of some trees the way a parent would take care of a kid. His fingers knew how rough the tree was and how the seasons changed. He never did anything in his life that made him seem like he would be the voice of the Most High. Still, it was that very person that the Lord's eyes were on. Why would God pick someone so normal to bring such an important message? What about a farmer who grows sycamores was better than kings, priests, or scribes? The answer is easy. God doesn't look at how someone looks, but at what's inside them. He found a willing spirit in that quiet servant. His name was Amos. The man was from the country and didn't have any religious or royal blood. He had deep roots in the ground and his eyes were on heaven. Tekoa, his hometown, was not very interesting. In that place, taking care of trees all the time taught him how to read the signs of the seasons, wait for the right food, and listen to the silence. In this simple place, he heard a voice that wasn't from the wind or the leaves, but from God. It wasn't just a vague thought or a fleeting feeling. It was an order, a call that would change not only his life, but also the whole country. God didn't raise him to talk to his neighbors. He was told to cross the land and go to the faraway kingdom of Israel in the north, a country that was doing well on the outside but going apart on the inside. Jerusalem was living in the best of times at that time. Cities were protected, trade was booming, and religious celebrations were full of people, incense, dances, and gifts. It looked like everything was fine. For the Lord, though, it was just a show. There was abuse going on behind the plenty. When people prayed, they were selfish. Behind the scenes, people were selling sentences. Then God picked a man who wasn't a prophet to deal with all of this. He didn't learn from schools of preachers, and his family isn't from the Levites. He was just a field worker, the kind of person who gets up before the sun and works all day until they're tired. But he was sure of one thing that nothing could take away. He had been sent. Amos left his trees. He left Tekoa's calm flow. He left the ease of his normal life. His every step toward the north was brave and in line with what he was told. He wasn't sure if anyone would listen, but he knew he had to speak up. He didn't have any awards or gifts from priests on him. He brought a word, and that word, even though it came from a humble heart, would always be important. The difference was very clear. On one side, Israel showed off its wealth by wearing nice clothes and building castles out of ivory. On the other side, a man with a strong voice and dirty clothes showed up. But his words got through the masks and hit the mark. He spoke out against the dishonest judges who hurt the poor and those who fasted with their bodies but not their souls. He cried out for truth and justice in a world of wealth. He didn't just call for social change, it was to turn away from sin. Amos told them that God is not moved by offering, but by doing what is right, that he doesn't like music from people who are greedy, that he would rather hear the sound of justice running like a river than the sound of evil harps. Amos's voice was heard against kings, church leaders, and business people. Even though he wasn't part of the group, his words were strong and could not be argued with. He didn't speak for himself. He spoke on behalf of the one who can see everything, even what's going on inside the building. At first, he was by himself, but he knew what he had to do. No longer did he work with wild fig trees as his field, but with people's hearts. Each line hit the ground hard like a hoe blow. He didn't plant flowers of peace, he planted the seeds of truth. And that's always new and different, not just at that time. Before we go on, please leave a like on this video, subscribe to our channel, turn on alerts, and share this video with someone who needs to hear this message. They should believe that God still talks, even when few people want to hear it. This helps us get the Bible to people who need it most. Also, please leave a super thank you if you want to help this job. We can keep telling more Bible stories and spreading this message of faith and hope thanks to your gift. Thank you so much for your help. We'll keep going on our journey today. He didn't ask why. He didn't look for signs or ask for answers. He just obeyed the silent order that pulsed through him like a strong certainty. Like a lot of people who have been called from being unknown to do holy work, he didn't ask for advice or promises. He just walked. He knew that people would not listen to him because their hearts were hard, but he still left without looking back. His job wasn't with family or friends. No one would know them or make them feel welcome. The place they were going was a split land where interests and disagreements had broken up old ties of brotherhood. Still he went, even though his feet were dirty and his heart was full of the message of a fair God who warns before correcting. He did not carry any books. He didn't have any status. It wasn't crowded or full of caps when he arrived. He only had the unseen power of someone who had been sent with him, and that was enough. His only tool was his voice. But it wasn't just any voice. It was the sound of something that had been there forever. On his way across the dry Judean hills to the northern land, he moved farther away from Tekoa and toward a strange place that was very different from what he knew. It wasn't just a change of scenery. They were crossing cultural, political, and spiritual walls that they couldn't see. Even though the two countries came from the same place, they now saw each other as enemies. He was from the south, but he was sent to the middle of the north to tell them something that would really bother them. His eyes were met with a stark difference when he got to the city. Samaria was impressive, like a gem set in the hills. The halls were decorated with ivory, the houses showed how wealthy the people were, and the shops were always busy. The clothes were made of gold, the cups were full of wine, and the people looked safe. It seemed like these people thought that how much they had was a sign of God's blessing. But Amos saw past the flash. He didn't fall for fancy columns or sacred songs. His spiritual eyes saw people who were numbed by wealth and drunk on fake security. Poor people were ignored, abuse was passed off as progress, prayer was for nothing, and courts were bought with dirty money. Wealth was used as a veil to hide moral decline. His face didn't look like the faces of the other guys in the city. His simple clothes didn't go with the fancy linen. He seemed like he didn't belong because of his accent, and the way he was acting was scary. The priests of Bethel looked down their noses at him. The wealthy avoided him as if being around him were bothersome. But that didn't stop him. He started to talk even to people who thought he was an invader. He didn't look for places or wait for people to invite him. He walked with the people who went to the temples and spoke sharply like a blade. Not only were his speeches talks, but they were also warnings. That worship that doesn't care about the child is empty, he said. It's not real fasting if it doesn't lead to kindness. The fact that giving gifts with dirty hands doesn't make the all-seeing God happy. The message was clear. Israel had gone astray, even when there were feasts and offerings. Even though there were songs, no one said sorry. People spoke praise, but their hearts weren't there, and judgment was coming soon. Amos didn't yell because he was mad. He spoke from the heart. He wasn't mad at people. He was mad at God. He was aware that the words he spoke were not his own. He stayed strong even when people shut their faces and ears turned away. His job wasn't to make people happy, but to warn them. People thought of the Temple of Bethel as a holy place, but it was also a place where bad things happened. And that's where Amos spoke out against the priests, who liked the king's cheers more than the voice of the Spirit. He didn't ask about it. It was rude of him to bow. He just told them. His words seemed too harsh at that time, but God knew it had to be done. He would keep going even if not many people were listening, because his job didn't depend on praise, but on staying true to it. The person who spoke did not want to be praised. He also didn't avoid the subject. Every word he spoke was dense, with something important that could not be ignored. And it's interesting that he didn't start by blame the Israelites. Instead, at the start of his speech, he spoke out against the nearby countries that had been hurting God's people for generations. First, it was Damascus, which was criticized for having cruel forces. Then Gaza was blamed for using people as trade chips. Tyre came next, because it broke old ties to make money. Then Edom, Ammon, and Moab were shown to the people as if an unseen court were being set up right there. As the crowd listened, they were silent and felt a strange pleasure. It was only fair that their enemies were called out for being bad after all. At first, there was silence, but it quickly turned into stress. People looked different when Amos talked about Judah. The person who had been speaking on their behalf before now turned his attention to his own past. Before they could say anything, the last charge was made, and it wasn't about outsiders. It was a war against Israel. It got heavy in the air. The name of the country rang out like thunder. No longer did it feel good to listen. Now, every word seemed like an arrow aimed straight at lies. When Amos changed the subject, the pain also changed. He didn't just cross mountains on the way to that point. It meant giving up things that were important to you, like the safety of home, privacy, and even respect. Now, he stayed in front of people who looked at him suspiciously, not because he was wanted, but because he was told to. The scenery had changed. The fig tree farms were left behind. Now, in busy streets and religious hallways, people didn't want to hear him. But his voice got louder as the noise around him got louder. He spoke with authority, but not the authority of a man. It was the authority that comes from believing one is doing a divine task. Before religious people who always looked their best, Amos didn't bring soothing words. It wasn't that he preached wealth or made sweet promises. He gave a decision, which was clear, painful, and unavoidable. Not a lot of long talks from him. He liked short, sharp sentences. He spoke out against people who were mean to the poor, judges who sold their decisions, and the rich who built castles while people went hungry. He showed that even the most beautiful religious songs couldn't reach the skies if they came from cold, selfish hearts. He talked about a God who wasn't touched by meaningless acts, who wouldn't let unfair things ruin holy celebrations, who didn't enjoy fire when the poor's cries were ignored. The words of Amos showed that the Eternal wanted more than just ceremonies. He wanted justice to flow like water, and fairness to flow like a river that never ends. People were used to seeing fancy shrines, but now they were looking at an awkward image. The prophet showed that no matter how often or grand the rituals were, they had no value if they were not done with honesty. The city seemed to keep doing what it was doing. Priests did their jobs, offerings were made, and music played. For Amos, though, it was all just noise, smoke, and looks. The country as a whole was sick. In fact, God was so mad about it that he saw it. At that point, Amos wasn't just a stranger. He was like a rock in the shoe of a system that was meant to be easy. He went on, and even without praise, without recognition, without protection, because he wasn't depending on people accepting him for his goal. His calling came from heaven, and that was enough. From the outside, the routines kept going. There were religious parties in the streets, with songs being sung and offerings being burned on the altar. But their hearts were far apart on the inside. Worship and faith were put on display, but God was not listened to, even though he was called upon. Religion had turned into a show, a well-rehearsed play that didn't tell the truth. Amos knew this. So, his words hurt everyone. He clearly spoke to those who lived in ivory towers and got rich at the cost of lives that no one could see. He talked to traders who cheated by using unfair scales, and people who pretended to be religious but took advantage of weak people. Even the women of the rich couldn't get away. He criticized them for living in freedom while the people were being crushed, and cried out in vain. Every word he spoke was like a mirror that looked into the soul. People who were listening could turn their heads away, but they still saw themselves. The prophet's words made public what everyone wanted to keep secret. Pain was bound to happen. How could someone from the country who seemed so simple speak with such authority? How could he know about sins that had never been admitted in public? Amos, on the other hand, didn't need evidence. What he said came from somewhere bigger. God was the one who told everyone the secrets. Nothing is hidden when the Eternal shows itself. One of the most powerful things Amos said was that people shouldn't think they are spiritually immune. This group of people believed that they were safe because God had picked them. It's like divine choice is a shield that can't be broken. They thought that practices kept them safe, that the building itself kept evil away, and that the blessing would last no matter what they did. But the prophet used sharp words to break down these myths. Israel was picked, but that didn't give them untouchable luxury. It gave them duty. In that way, they had failed. They changed the agreement so that mercy was an excuse and justice was an appearance. Amos proved that the same God who calls is also the one who asks. And that judgment didn't just happen to other people, it started at home. For a while, people didn't just mouth the prophet's words. They were talked about in public. They got into the market vendors, the grounds of palaces, temples, and the hallways of the court. Some people heard and felt bad about it. Some people became angry. But most people claimed not to hear, even though they were feeling uneasy. It was like they had their teeth stuck between their consciousness and their teeth. There wasn't a lot of guilt in the air because of the prosperity. A lot of people chose to ignore the message rather than deal with what it meant. But Amos didn't give up. It did not matter if the audience was unfriendly, the setting was bad, or the crowd's silence showed that they did not care. He was called to preach, not to persuade. The goal of the task wasn't to get prizes right away. It was to plant. The seed had to be planted even if it looked like the ground wasn't wet. Even though it wasn't time to turn around yet, the warning had already been given. His voice could be heard above the shops and up the stairs where the leaders lived. It got into the houses and into the daily lives of the religious, the judges, and the people who stood around the king. No longer was Amos seen as a nomadic person with ideas. He was now a threat to the safety of the strong. It got worse for the priests. Talk about this man who got people angry reached the king. Officials were afraid that this disturbance would lead to people being unhappy. Even though the prophet knew things were getting worse around him, he didn't change. There was no political air about him in his words, no drive to get better as a person. He did nothing but repeat what was given to him. That alone was enough to shake things up. Because even the tallest walls start to fall apart when God speaks. The bravery of Amos was just as bad as what he said. He didn't spare anyone. He didn't try to be neutral or pick easy targets. It was clear that he was calling attention to the mistakes of his own people, which many people could not stand. It sounded like public criticism was upsetting the political and religious balance of the country, especially when things seemed to be going well. Amaziah, the priest of Bethel, was one of the first people to rise up against him. In addition to being a religious leader, he was also a very important political person. He was in charge of one of the most important places of worship in the northern kingdom. The fact that Amos was there scared him because it put at risk both the established faith and the order that kept him in his job. A lot of people saw Bethel as a holy place, but there was another truth behind the temples and songs. It was idolatry that looked like custom, manipulation that looked like theology, and power that looked like religion. And Amos's speech, which cut through everything, became too much for people who were getting help from the system. Amaziah didn't waste any time. He wrote a letter to King Jeroboam II in which he accused Amos of plotting against the throne. He said that what he said made people angry and that he taught the end of the country and the death of the king. These were very serious charges, especially at a time when anyone could sell peace as a sign of God's blessing. This was a risky charge because any talk of instability could be seen as treason. And to make things even worse, Amaziah didn't just write letters. In person, he went to talk to the teacher. He told him to go back to his home country in a way that seemed polite but was really mean. The prophet should speak to his own people in Judah. He even said in a funny way that Amos was using the situation to get more respect, as if his goal were to make money or become famous. That didn't stop Amos, though. He replied in a cool but firm way. He made it clear that he wasn't a trained predictor. He wasn't part of any faith group and didn't get the skill from anyone else. He came from a simple background. He worked the land and led flocks, and he knew more about the quiet of the countryside than the halls of power. He wasn't supposed to go that way. He was called to it. He heard the voice of God, so how could he keep quiet? It was now clear that the message and the system were at odds with each other. On one side, there is a well-known priest with political clout who is supported by structures of power and custom. But on the other side was a man with only a goal and no labels or allies. His power didn't come from being related to someone, but from obeying them. Even though it looked simple, that was stronger than any religious robe. He didn't speak for Judah. He wasn't there out of patriotism or pride in himself. There was no king or religion that he had to be loyal to. It had something to do with the God who took him from being unknown to being in front of kings and crowds. Even though it was tempting to leave, he didn't, because the Eternal One, not people, was in charge of his soul. The fight with Amaziah was a sign of the pushback the preacher had to deal with. A way of running things that hid the truth behind religion. That got custom and morality mixed up. That saw any voice that didn't agree as an enemy, even if it was a voice from God warning them. But Amos did not follow the rules. He didn't try to explain himself. He wasn't trying to please anyone. He just didn't give in. Like a person who knows his job is not to get praise, but to build loyalty. No matter what the threats were, he knew he had to say something, and he wouldn't give up until that word came true. Those fights were between more than just a preacher and a priest. It was a battle between justice and looks. It was when truth and convenience met. Amos stood his ground, even though he didn't have a chair or a dress. It wasn't Amos who spoke for him. He stood for the one who can see what can't be seen. The God who knows not only what is said at temples, but also what is decided behind the scenes of power. His presence was scary because it showed a hidden religion that was hidden behind traditions and outward appearances. And his refusal to give in was more than just a personal fight. It was a battle between fake religion and the real word of the Eternal One. The voice that sent him did not stay quiet while priests and leaders planned ways to shut him up. God spoke some more, and Amos stayed where he should have been, firm, obedient, and faithful, even though people turned their backs on him. One night, while everyone slept under the stars, something strange took place. Amos saw something. It wasn't a normal dream, and it wasn't caused by stress. He thought that the skies had opened up, and the thoughts of the Most High were there for him to see. He would now not only speak, but also see. This was the start of a new part of his task. The first picture was scary. Following the first crop, when the land was most at risk, he saw clouds of locusts appear. Bugs that were very hungry ate everything, including fields, trees, and roots. The green went away. Life dried up. There would be hunger. Amos couldn't do anything about what he saw until he fell to his knees in prayer. "Lord, how can Jacob resist?" he begged with a shaking voice. "He's so little." God heard him. He said with kindness, "This will not happen." But the peace didn't last long. Soon another picture showed up. This time it was a fire that seemed to come from deep within the earth and destroy it from the ground up. The fire wasn't natural. It was judgment in the form of flames, a fire that went beyond what could be seen and reached all the way down to the ground's roots. Once more, Amos couldn't stand what he saw. He begged the Lord to spare his people, his heart breaking. "That won't happen either," was the answer again. Even though people turned their backs on him and treated him badly, Amos did not harden his heart. He didn't just send words, he also felt them. He spoke for people and prayed for them. His job wasn't to party when bad things happened, but to tell people before they did. His job wasn't to do what was right, it was to ask for forgiveness. Then there was a third vision. This one didn't bring disaster right away, but it did bring something even worse, a final choice. He saw the Lord holding a straight line and using it to check the accuracy of a wall that had been built. That simple picture said a lot. The line showed whether something was level or tilted, safe or about to fall. It was clear what the message meant. Don't wait any longer. God had sized up his people. No longer would plagues or fire be used to punish people. Now, truth would be used instead. There were no more reasons that the Lord would take. Each person would get a fair evaluation, and there would be no more way for someone to step in. The third image was different from the first two. In the first two, Amos could cry out and see God's kindness come through. Now, though, there was no ask. There was no way to work things out. Something had come to an end. The alert had been sent. The messenger had already talked. Now it's time for the straight line to make its decision. Amos knew that the next part of his task had begun. No longer should prayers be offered. It was time to make it clear that the choice had been made. People would have to face their own abnormality, the way their hearts were changing, and the gap between what they said they thought and what they lived. The prophet knew he had to keep going, even though he felt bad about it, because the God who called him was fair and patient at the same time, and that level of kindness had gone too far. The level line was now going down, and nobody could hide the truth. Of all the dreams God gave Amos, one of the most mysterious was also the most important. He saw a basket full of fully ripe fruit that was at its best. It was a beautiful picture, but it was also the last one. This kind of fruit doesn't last long. They show that the season is over and there is nothing left to gather. Now, everything will just wait to break down. It was easy to understand. The people had finally had enough. The person would not be warned again. It was no longer time to harvest. From now on, the punishment would be seen through. Even though it looked fine on the outside, everything was about to fall apart on the inside. In contrast to the past visions, this one did not come with prayer or pleading. There was nowhere to beg for help. Amos knew what was going on. Time was up. God would still talk, but people would not be able to hear. No, men would be lost because they wouldn't know how to hear the words of the Most High. The Lord told people that there would be a famine, but it wouldn't be a lack of food or water. They would go hungry for something they had hated before, His word. Men and women would go across lands and mountains to find help, but all they would find was the sound of a terrible quiet. The time to answer had already passed. The prophet's trip reached a point where it could no longer be turned back from. There was no longer any hope for a change in the group. Instead, there was only the knowledge that judgment would come. After a very long time, God's patience came to an end there, and Amos was the only one who had to tell everyone what they didn't want to hear. He knew there wouldn't be a party after his speech. Even though what he said was true, he knew it would hit hard ground. But still, he went on, not to look good, not because they want to be famous, but because he wouldn't say anything would be an insult to the one who sent him. The stark difference between how serious the message was and how cold the response was made it even worse. People were not moved. Even when they had clear views and clear signs, their hearts and ears were closed, and their lack of interest seemed stronger than fear itself. Now it seemed like Amos was preaching to a wall as he went on. His words, which used to make people feel bad, were now just background noise. The crowd liked religious holiday music, dances that had been practiced, and the comfort of customs. What used to be holy was now a show. He strolled through the towns and felt sad as he saw everything go on as if nothing had been said. A lot of people still went to the shrines. Offerings were made with a lot of heart. It was in the churches that singers tuned their voices, but those things didn't touch heaven. Worship had turned into a show. Prayer was just a warm-up. And the master's goals got in the way of justice, which should flow like living water. Amos was the one who saw the wrongdoings. He saw the humble being bought and sold for ridiculous amounts of money. The courts, which should have been fair, were up for grabs. People with power used trade to take advantage of and get rich at the cost of the weakest people. Women were seen as things to be used and then forgotten. A lot of young people fell into a deep hole of crime and unhappiness. And even with all of this going on, the majority's silence was dead silence. People who were able to speak out wanted to keep their rights. Leaders said they couldn't see. Religious leaders said it was okay. People thought nothing would change because they were used to it. Amos knew things would change, though. Not the way you thought they would, but with force. because no wall can stand against God's wrath when it comes to the end. He would never forget those who were hurt. He wouldn't look away from innocent blood. He would not stand for ridicule that was dressed up as religion. So even though he was turned down, the preacher kept going, not because they want to be praised, but because they feel like they have to share the truth, even if no one wants to hear it. Even after hearing everything, a lot of people still held on to a weak sense of safety. They kept saying, "The Lord is with us," as if it were a defense. Even though they spoke with confidence, their behaviors showed that the connection wasn't real. Faith had turned into a charm, a meaningless religious phrase that was used not to honor God, but to feel in charge. Amos felt bad when he saw this. People kept saying God's name, but they didn't listen to his heart. It was said that he was there, but no one felt it. People had been deeply hurt in their hearts, and he, who was that voice calling for people to turn away, felt more and more alone. There were not many people around him. He didn't have any followers. No one spoke again what he said. He didn't start a school or leave a group of students behind. His goal wasn't liked by many. He was just one man, but he had a message that had to be said, even if no one would listen. And as time went on, he could feel how far away they were. The space between his words and the hearts that didn't want to hear them. The public's consciousness had been dulled by institutionalized faith. The spiritual leaders did not want to fight. The people in charge saw him as a threat to their power. The merchants treated him like he was crazy. Normal people were so busy with their daily lives that they didn't even notice that a spiritual bomb was about to go off right in front of their eyes. But Amos did not give up. He spoke some more, not because they are proud, not because they are stubborn. However, because there was something more important than him. He couldn't stay quiet because he loved the Lord. His voice wasn't his own. It had to do with the truth. He would talk as long as there was a chance to wake someone up, even if it was just one person out of 1,000. He stayed even when it seemed like he was speaking to the wind, because he was alone there and had a deep connection with God, which not many people understand. It hurt other people too when they didn't listen to him after they should have. And it was the pain of the one who made us. They both knew what it was like to not be heard when they spoke. Both knew that people who should have spoken up but didn't know what to say. This closeness that grew out of being turned down made Amos more than just a prophet. He became a witness to God's patience, which means waiting to act until it is warned. His words became more important with each new prophet, not by choice, but because they had to. His messages used to be filled with hope, but now they were filled with a clear message. The end was near. He stopped asking for change. He now told them what was going to happen. It wasn't what he wanted. It happened because some people turned down every chance. The words didn't come from anger, they came from pain. He didn't talk like an enemy. He talked like someone who knew the heart of the one who sees everyone, judges everyone, and loves everyone. So Amos walked through towns that didn't notice him. He went by buildings that were still full of practices that were not being done. He saw judges sell punishments, con artists take advantage of weak people, women being thrown away, and young people becoming crooked. In everything, he saw not only wrongdoing, but also a warning that was not used. It was now too late to avoid the ruling that could have been avoided. So many times, God had talked. He had waited, sent messages, and spoken out. But people chose not to pay attention to him. Once, the prophet begged for forgiveness. Now, with tears in his eyes, he spoke of destruction. When Amos's job was over, he didn't see any changes in the group. He did not see a revive. He didn't see any changes. But it wasn't his job to reap. It was to plant. His words reached people of all ages. They could be heard outside of Samaria's walls. His words lived on, even though not many people listened to them at the time. That's why the voice that speaks for God never gets lost. It might be forgotten for a while, but in the end, someone will be ready to listen. And Amos, the man who didn't have any titles, fame, or praise, finished his trip by doing what was asked of him. By yourself, maybe, but fully praised before God. The images didn't end. For Amos, the places where there used to be feasts and music were now empty and quiet in his mind. The proud city of Samaria looked like a field of rubble. Palaces that used to host parties and important people were now broken and empty. He saw mums rip their kids out of their arms. Families were split up without any comfort. The altars were empty and covered in dust from not being used in a while. They used to be filled with incense and the sounds of religious people. The land that used to be full of wealth was now empty, as if the ground had wept. And he could see all of this pain very clearly. It was about them. Amos cared about those people, even though nobody seemed to care about him. Even though people didn't trust him and pushed him to the edges of society, he didn't say destruction in a cold way. Each word he spoke was filled with the pain of someone who knows how important life is and is about to end. His message was never a call to hurt someone. There was neither pride nor pleasure in declaring disaster. He spoke a sorrow when he did. It was like seeing someone jump off a cliff after being warned so many times. It's not because God didn't love them, because people had been covering their ears every day. There was no way to go back. The line was the last word. From the north would come an army. Israel is going to fall. Its business, political ties, and religious rituals would all be taken apart, along with the security system that people were so proud to build. Not by chance, not because God is unfair, but because of pride, evil, worshipping false gods, and a hard heart. Still, Amos did not run away. He didn't look for safety or rest. He stayed there, one of them, looking into the eyes of the people who didn't like him, using the same level of force. He knew that he would not be praised, but rather known as the one who brought bad luck. He accepted this as his fate, because his promise wasn't to please the people, but to follow the Lord who sent him all the way. Each word made me feel like time was running out. It's like every phrase could be their last chance to wake up. Maybe not all of them, but maybe one. One heart and one face in the crowd, one of many who would be moved by what they heard. It was clear to Amos that the group's fate was set. Some people may have still had hope, though, if they decided to go back, say sorry in private, and be humble instead of fighting. So his speech wasn't just condemnation, it was also a call, and call to a conscience that could still be aroused. The prophet was always struggling with something. On the one hand, the weight of seeing destruction coming. On the other, the determination to keep preaching, even if no one applauds or looks back. It wasn't his job to pick food, it was to plant seeds. He sowed with hope, even though the ground was dry. The job wasn't simple. His shoulders were heavy with the pain of knowing the end was coming and the resolve to keep going city by city without knowing who would listen or laugh. He was by himself, but that was fine. Because where there is truth, even if it comes from one person, there is power. Amos was sure that everything would fall apart. He would be there himself to see the sentence he called for. In the end, he would have to helplessly watch what he tried to stop happen. But on the inside, he stayed strong, because he had been true. What had to be said had been said. He screamed while there was still time. Heaven knew who he was, even if everyone else forgot about him. The people in charge might not remember his name, but the memory of the God who raised him up took it down. That was enough. The prophet spoke some harsh words and saw pictures of destruction, pain, and spreading. Then, out of the blue, something unexpected came out. It wasn't an emotional or overly enthusiastic speech. It was like a spark in the wind or a sad song's soft note. Small, but enough to keep the darkness from taking over fully. Even though God was fair, he showed his people that he would not leave them forever. They would be judged, yes. It would be a terrible disaster for the land, the altars and mansions would fall, and the exile would come to an end. But God would not forget the promise he made with Abraham's children. Even though it looked weak to people, the thread of hope was still living. Then Amos talked about David's fallen tent. He didn't use big words or pictures that were easy to understand. He only talked about that old building, which was a sign of the chosen kingdom and the relationship between God and his people. That tent, which looked like it was going to disappear, would be brought back one day. Not like before. Not in the mold that didn't work, but not the same way. Got back, full and firm. What was broken would be put back together again. The cracks will be fixed. There would be a new starting, deeper, more real and more true, when the doors were opened again. It would not be a repeat of what had happened before. By God's help, what seemed lost would be brought back. But this promise didn't change what was going to happen. There would be destruction. People would have to leave their homes. For a while, the land would not produce anything. There would be silence in the temple. But a new circle would start at the right time, which is God's time. There would be rebuilding of things, but most importantly, there would be rebuilding of connections. Cities would be fixed up. Fields would grow well again. Aside from that, though, the connection between God and his creations would be fixed. What was hurt by pride and empty religion would get better with forgiveness and kindness. This idea wasn't just a cheap way for Amos to feel better. His words were already very harsh, and that wasn't going to change. It was an honest display of God's steadfastness. The God who punishes is also the God who heals. The Lord who corrects is also the one who loves. And when he lets pain happen, it's not to destroy, but to wake us up. This hope wasn't for cocky people. It wasn't for people who laughed at the warnings. A small seed was dropped, and maybe only hearts that were quiet saw it. By people who heard even when they didn't have a voice. By people who believed even though they were scared. For the few who hid the words of judgment in their hearts like a key. The promise was like an imaginary line that went past the fall and the flight. Something that led to a time when God would live with his people again. In that place, justice would not be the rare event, but the normal course of events, where the building would be made of hearts instead of stones. Amos said it, even though he didn't know how it would all work out. The person who had said the end was now pointing to a new start. Before that, his message was full of pain and urgency. At the end, it was full of hope, not trust in people, not trust in kings, but have faith in God's character. He is the only one who can be both just and loving at the same time. He might not have been heard by many. It's possible that almost nobody got it. But that last note was planted in time like a seed. And like all seeds, it doesn't grow right away. It waits until the soil is right. It was finally time for Amos's job to end. He said what had to be said. He cried because he had to. He went through what he had to go through. Before he went silent, he said one last thing. God's love will never end, even though punishment is coming. Law and order would come down like a storm, but then it would rain, which would water the new. Life would eventually grow again, thanks to a God who wants to heal even when he is hurt. Amos did more than just say that the building was falling down. He was also the voice that pointed to a future, even in the ashes. Not only did he cry, but he also set a seed for the future. His promise went beyond what was happening in Israel at that time. In a time when all nations would turn to the Lord, not because they had to, but because they truly wanted to be saved. That word would have reached all nations and all times. This dream didn't come up during a party. It was born in the shade of a tragedy that was going to happen. Still, it looked like a single star in a sky full of thick clouds. It might be small, but you can still see it. And this light showed the prophet his last steps, even when it looked like nothing else was moving. When he stopped talking, there was no big deal across the country. There was no fast. There wasn't a crowd there to confess. The people just kept going. The routine kept going as usual. The shops opened, religious ceremonies went on as planned, and offerings were still made at the altars, like nothing was said, like they hadn't been warned. After that, Amos was no longer seen. No one looked for him or talked to him. He went back to the obscurity that he had left behind. His shape became less clear in the city streets and farms where he used to work. No one asked for help. He wasn't questioned by any leaders. It was like he had never been there and his job was over. But God didn't forget while people did. That voice, which was ignored so often, had been heard and written down in heaven. Before the chair, every word was written. From the first warning to the last hope, nothing was missed. There was no point. After that, time went by, and after some time, happiness came. The kingdom that no one thought could fall came crashing down like a wave. Strangers marched across Israel's hills. Samaria, which used to be proud, bowed down to the outside force. People stole from the castles, which used to be home to powerful people. Families were split up, kids were taken away, and the aged were not cared for. The fields, which used to produce plenty, were turned into dust. The country that wouldn't listen was now walking through the rubble. People who had made fun of the preacher now spoke in a desperate way, words they had once laughed at. It was too late, though. There was more than just people in the silence that now hung over the land. It was also quiet with God. Now was no longer the time to warn. No more news was given out. There were no more pleas. The sky had a voice before, but now they were quiet. When Amos's warning was ignored, it came back to haunt them. Each phrase was spoken as a lament by those who lived. It wasn't just a threat anymore. It was a memory of a chance that was missed, in response to a warning of a preacher that no one cared about. Still, even though everything was falling apart, Amos's words of hope stayed. Like roots that are tucked away in the dry ground, not seen for a while, but still living, since the story wasn't over yet. There was a real fall. The pain had to happen. The promise, though, of a future healing, a meeting between God and his people, and a new start stayed. Not for those who didn't change, but for the few who had believed, maybe in quiet. The prophet was no longer there. The voice stopped. The Bible, on the other hand, never ends. It lasts through generations, lives on into the future, and grows at the right time. And Amos, the man from the country who didn't want to be famous and spoke up even though no one paid attention, had done his job because he was honest. And being honest with God is always remembered. It didn't matter when the voices stopped talking and the temples went about their business. Amos' word was still important. The silence hung in the air like an echo that won't go away even after the sound has stopped. It was done with the job. He wasn't sent to persuade, but to tell. Yes, he did, with strength, in pain, and with loyalty. The words that people of his time thought were stupid did not get lost in time. They were kept safe, written down, saved, and they would be read again and again for generations, read out loud, feared. Okay, I get it. Because everything that comes from God lasts, even if people don't pay attention to it at first. There was something in the silence after he spoke. Pain was able to do what the warning failed to do because there was room for it. While the last plea was being looked over, the time of waiting changed to the time of consequence. But even there, where rules were in place, the promise was still there. Restoration was still there, but it was dormant until the right time. Amos was the one who spoke out in a religious crowd. Someone who spoke up when no one else did were they. When he finally stopped talking, there were no statues, honors, or tributes. He went back to the privacy he had left behind and walked through the hills he knew again, maybe to take care of his trees. He went out of sight the same way he came in, quiet, obedient, and carrying something heavier than himself. But his impact wasn't based on how well known he was. No one took up his flag or became a student to spread his name after he died. He left behind a mark that can't be seen but will last forever. A warning that God loves fairness and that true faith can't live without it. His story shows us that following orders doesn't always lead to results right away. That not all people who serve God will see the results of their dedication in this life. But in the Lord's eyes, being consistent is more important than being praised. Amos did not see a change in the group. He didn't see a recovery happen. Heaven did not forget about him, though. He was raised up by God not because of how important he was, but because he was ready to do so. His family didn't come from castles, and he didn't go to school with the preachers. He was a man from the country, easy, but with a heart that is in line with heaven. That was enough for the Lord to put him in front of kings, leaders, and priests. Because when God wants to talk, he gets people who are ready to listen, not always the most educated ones. One important lesson that Amos's journey tells us of is that real spiritual power doesn't come from titles, but from being with God. His life stands in contrast to those who act religiously but don't care about fairness. He spoke out against the disconnect between prayer and action, service and behavior, and the platform and everyday life. It wasn't just animals that people offered. They also killed poor people because they were poor. They sang praises, but they kept the truth from being heard. They fasted, but they were harsh. All of this was turned down by God. He doesn't want empty ceremonies. He wants people to give their all. Amos was live proof that faith that doesn't show up in justice is faith that is dead. We should follow his lead and stick to the truth, even if it makes us feel alone. In a world that values ease, acceptance, and agreement, Amos asks us to speak out as prophets, not to guess what will happen in the future, but to bravely live in the present, to speak out against evil, praise good, and spread hope, even if no one cheers. His story is still told today as a warning. Our wishes may sound beautiful, but the things people do don't show kindness. When people show their faith, but forget about those who are suffering. That's exactly why Amos's message is still important. He tells us that God can see. He sees the abused. He sees those who are bad. He can tell who is serious. He can tell who is acting fake. He sees the good people being ignored and the bad people being praised. But he is still the God who warns before he acts and wants to repair even after making things right. At the end of his trip, Amos was still obeying God. This is the best evidence a worker can leave, because God makes something eternal when loyalty meets purpose, even if no one sees it. Do you want to be faithful like Amos? Write it in the comments if this story moved you. Please check out this movie and share it with someone you care about. It's still important for many people to hear the truth and have their hearts opened. Thank you for following us to the end of this incredible story. See you in the next video. May God be with you always. Amen.